Let's talk about some very important basic concepts related to VR, but actually also to AR and MR, which are tracking, rendering, and display. Tracking to start with. Tracking basically means measuring people's body movements, measuring the body movements of the user of your VR system, of your VR setup. You can, for instance, measure their body position through those infrared cameras. If you use certain sensors, you can track and measure their head rotation and their eye movements. Especially the eye movements of your user are very important, because what you want is that you can adapt the virtual world that they are perceiving to where somebody is looking. Very closely related to the concept of rendering, which means that you take a 3D model. This model not necessarily has to be an avatar or an agent. It can also just be the 3D model of a virtual environment, and you instantiate the proper sensory information for the newly tracked location. So the idea is someone has a VR headset on their head, or they are in this cave environment. You track what they are doing, where they are looking, and you sort of render online the virtual world according to the movements of the user, such that if your user looks up, they will see a ceiling. If they look down, they will see the ground, for instance. Tracking and rendering are very closely connected. What's also very related to those two concepts, of course, is display. Display is a manner in which the physical senses are replaced with digital information. The visual senses, for instance, your eyes, what you see, in those cases, the real world is, of course, replaced often by a screen. It can be the screen of your smartphone in one of those cardboard headsets. It can be a large projection screen in those cave environments. That's the display. Will be also, in the case of computers, for instance, your computer screen, that will be the display. Or in the case of when you're watching TV, the TV would be your display. Those three concepts are very important to keep in mind for people who are creating those virtual reality and also AR and MR experiences. They're also important when you think of creating, for instance, virtual agents or avatars. In those cases, you can think of tracking a real person's behavior, for instance, outside of a lab or inside a lab, track all their movements, track what they say, track where they look, and then online or offline, which means later, render it onto a virtual equivalent of that person. So if you have tracked all those different types of information, you can render it onto a virtual equivalent of that person. And then, for instance, you could display this virtual agent or this avatar via a smartphone or via one of those projection screens in a cave environment. So those three concepts, very related and very important. They are sort of the conceptual basis for every virtual reality, but also AR or MR experience.